Hi, I'm Weston LaBar, and welcome to another episode of People on the Move, a Cargomatic podcast. With me here today, Jon Gold, Vice President of Supply Chain and Customs Policy for the National Retail Federation. John's been a guest of ours before, and he's been a great friend in the industry. Jon, thanks for joining us today to let us know what the retail sector is experiencing in 2023.
Hey, Weston, good to see you. Always happy to join the podcast.
Yeah, thanks again for coming. So tell us a little bit. This has been a tale of really two tales for the retail industry. You've got, in some cases, best or near best consumer spending, buying a lot, continuing to still buy a lot of things. We're seeing some really good data on the big buying seasons, back to school, holidays. Obviously, a lot went on, and we'll get into the Amazon Prime days, but a lot of retailers took advantage of their own version of that this year, but still experiencing the impacts of COVID, the latent impacts of over inventory for the spending that was going on during the 2.5-year period where people were stuck at home. So on one side, business is good. On the other side, trying to figure out how to offload some product that they don't want to keep around any longer for obvious reasons. So Jon, what are you hearing from your members? Give us a little bit of an insight as to what big retailers are dealing with here at a little bit past the midway point of 2023.
Yeah, thanks, Weston. I mean, I think, looking over the past couple of years, it certainly has been a challenge for retailers, small and large, as you've seen differing buying patterns that have been happening. But, all throughout, the consumer remains strong, despite the headwinds we're seeing in retail with, higher prices and inflation. Retailers certainly, or consumers certainly, have shifted some of their buying patterns, where during the pandemic, when they were stuck at home, they were buying up everything to fix up their house, redo certain elements in their housing, buying stuff for the kids. I know I certainly bought a ton of stuff to keep my kids occupied. But now coming out of it, as we're now getting back into a somewhat normal, pattern, comparing this back to like 2019, I mean, we've seen continued month-on-month growth in the retail industry and retail spending. Obviously, we're down as to kind of where we were as consumers are shifting back from only buying goods to now buying services as they're now out traveling, going back to the restaurants, going to concerts, everything else. But they're still buying. But they're shifting their patterns now and only buying kind of essential goods and goods for loved ones. And that's part of the reason why you're seeing kind of the holiday sales coming in so strongly, because that's what consumers are really focusing in on.
Yeah, I had mentioned Prime Day. This was the first year I participated in Prime Day. My wife and I were locked in the hospital for that week, expecting the birth of our second child. And I bought all kinds of things that I really needed in that moment because the deals were so great. And as I said, there's a lot of other retailers that have done the same thing. Talk a little bit about the phenomenon of the big sales. We used to have back to school sales, which we still do, Black Friday. There were some key, what I'll call retail holidays, where people went and spent on very purposeful things. But now you've got retailers creating their own versions of that. And a lot of it's around e-commerce and really clearing out inventory. So can you talk a little bit about the Prime Day? Is that something that you think we're going to see for the majority of retailers moving forward because of the success of this year? Or is it more of a phenomenon of they needed to purge overstocked goods, and so this was a great opportunity to do it? What do you think?
I mean, look, I think it's a combination of factors that are going into that. Obviously, the continued growth of e-commerce continues to play into this. And as consumers are shopping and buying in multiple different avenues, online, mobile, in-store, buy online, pick up in store, all these different opportunities they have to buy, retailers are continuously looking for ways to engage the consumer and get them to continue to buy. So obviously the success that we've seen from Prime Day over the past couple of years, other retailers have taken notice and are now trying out their own versions of this. One of the issues too, as you noted, the excess inventory we've seen over the past couple of years, it's a good opportunity to try and get rid of some of that merchandise that really don't need at this point in time, but the consumers are still looking for. Also, we've seen a phenomenon over the past couple of years where consumers are now buying earlier in the holiday season than they were in the past. Typically, years ago, you would wait till Black Friday to start your holiday shopping. Now consumers are starting the shopping earlier and earlier. They're starting as early as October sometimes to do that. Part of that, was some of the congestion and availability issues we saw throughout the pandemic. But even prior to that, we started seeing buying earlier in the season, and retailers certainly were planning for that as they started shifting their peak season earlier than it was. Typically peak season was September, October. It started creeping up in August, in July, and it kind of sticks around to that point now.
Yeah, and one of the other things, obviously coming out of the pandemic, it took a little bit of time for the supply chain to catch up, and it took time for manufacturing to get back up and running in certain areas overseas, specifically China, which despite many of the Trump era tariffs, which I want to give you a chance to talk about because I know that that's one of the big subjects and has been for the NRF for several years now. But obviously, the tariffs helped shift some of the manufacturing centers for certain retailers and certain U.S. importers. But then COVID essentially shut those manufacturing centers down for quite some time, and some haven't still not come back. Talk a little bit about what well, first of all, I think that the legacy being left by those Trump era tariffs because of the further impacts of COVID are maybe going to be a lot more impactful than maybe we thought, because it's not as easy to just undo them today as it would have been several years ago and let that trade rekindle itself. But also how your members are responding to the changing in global trade lanes. There's a lot of issues going on, and we'll dive a little bit into the labor issues because we've got obviously clarity there, and then obviously Panama Canal. But how are your members continuing to respond to what really started with the Trump administration, with the tariffs, and then continuously got more and more complicated throughout the zero COVID policies with the pandemic in China?
Yeah, I mean, look, first and foremost, the Trump era tariffs are now the Biden era tariffs because they continue today. And I think we've collected more tariffs on products from China under the Section 301 tariffs under the Biden administration than we did under the Trump administration, unfortunately. And we're waiting for the United States Trade Representative to come out with their results of their 4-year review to figure out whether or not the tariffs are going to remain, if they're going to change, if they're going to be added to other products. So, we're waiting to see what happens with that. But, as you noted, a lot of retailers have been looking at supply chain diversification for years, even prior to the tariffs that came into effect on China. That certainly tried to speed certain things up as retailers started to look elsewhere to try and figure out if there was capacity elsewhere to make some of those products that were subject to the tariffs. But there was still a lot of uncertainty as to how long the tariffs were going to stay. You had Trump officials saying short-term pain for long-term gain, but we've gained absolutely nothing by having the tariffs in effect. We haven't gotten anything that we wanted. We haven't fixed the IPR protection issues or the forced tech transfer issues, which were the genesis for the 301 complaint. Instead, we got into a tit for tat trade war where China retaliated like we all expected them to do, except for certain Trump officials. And then President Trump got angry at the retaliation, so he retaliated on top of that. So we are where we are today. But with that, the tariffs, and then comes COVID, where the globe basically shut down, and retailers were scrambling to try and find product and get it to the store shelves. And I think that certainly provided an opportunity for retailers to increase their diversification and look to shift away from China and look to not just have a single source for their goods. So you've seen a lot of folks go to a China plus one, plus two, and that continues today. The challenge though is that there's nobody who has the capacity that China does. So you can't just replicate the supply chain you have in China with one other country. You've got to kind of push that out. And other markets filled up very quickly. I mean, folks shifted to Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, India, and that continues today. But it takes time to re-up your supply chain, to find a new vendor that can do everything you need them to do, that can meet all of your requirements. Do they have the labor, the sophisticated labor they need for certain products? Do they have the regular sailings coming into the ports that we need? How's the infrastructure? All those different issues, as well as if you have certain products that have to be tested for product safety, for children's safety, that takes some time as well. So it's not something you can easily pick up a phone book, pick somebody, go, I'm going to go with them tomorrow, and then you start manufacturing. It doesn't work like that. It takes months, if not years, to reestablish. But obviously throughout the pandemic, folks understood the need to diversify and get a better understanding and better visibility into what's happening in their supply chain at any point in time. and that certainly continues today. And you've seen it in the numbers that have, trade with China certainly has gone down as far as the imports go, and other countries have benefited from that. And from our perspective, that's a good thing as folks look to diversify and go to other countries. The challenge though is that if this administration wants to continue to encourage folks to force outside of China, whether it's friendshoring, nearshoring, what have you, they need to work with those industries to help them find those opportunities. We need to get real free trade agreements being negotiated that provide for market access and tariff relief. We need to look at some of the rules of origin that currently exist in current programs and say, do they need to be updated to meet the needs of the 21st century global supply chain? One would argue things like yarn forward rules of origin don't work anymore because, we're 20, 30 years past when that worked. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there that we need to continue to push forwards. Unfortunately, this administration hasn't been one to want to negotiate new FTAs. They're negotiating these frameworks that are very high level that, I think kind of miss the opportunity for some of the traditional FTAs that we think will be better suited to help folks both invest and also help exports as well, which is a big part of this too.
Yeah, and I'm glad you used the word diversification, because diversification isn't just happening with retailers in foreign markets for manufacturing, but really for the last 20 years, it's been evolving in the US with four corner strategies. I would say anytime there's a labor negotiation issue on the US West Coast, more and more of your members say, okay, how do we protect ourselves from any sort of labor strife that we don't have any skin in the game other than we need these ports to function, right? And, I know after 2014, 15, that's when you saw a lot of large retailers look at a four corner strategy. And I think it's even one step further. It's gone in the fact that there's a lot of big importers that have looked at smaller non-traditional ports. You look at like Mercedes with Mobile, trying to use that as a dedicated port, or even some of the specialized products you see with Mercedes competitor BMW and Greer, where they're able to use Charleston and Norfolk and have dedicated rail to these inland port facilities. It's really shifted the game. And I think retailers are probably doing their best to try to synchronize their manufacturing strategies with their domestic supply chain strategies, because we haven't seen the level of nearshoring from a manufacturing, maybe an semblance, but not the manufacturing part of the equation. We haven't seen nearshoring in places like Mexico to the extent that we anticipated. There's still a lot of challenges that happen in Mexico, politically and otherwise. Talk a little bit about that balancing act, because more and more of your members will say, I'm trying to use other seaports outside of the U.S. West Coast in case there's port congestion or in case there's a labor issue. And I'm sure California's public policy uncertainty with electric trucks and Lord knows what the next thing they want to regulate is, but a whole host of environmental and labor policies that expose a lot of retailers for setting up operations here that they don't have already. If they don't already have them, I guess is the right way to say it. So talk a little bit about that balancing act, because a lot of folks will talk about the four corners type strategy, that U.S. diversification, but then also they're trying to pair that with where am I building things? Where are things coming from? And sometimes they just don't go hand in hand. And when you rely on something like the Panama Canal or many of these larger ships that are coming into non-traditional seaports, you have issues.
No, absolutely. That diversification is throughout the supply chain. You've got to have that match all along. So, you got to make sure you're sourcing folks, you're talking to your transportation folks, talking to supply chain, so everybody understands what this whole process is going to look like from end to end. And that diversification goes beyond just in case of labor negotiations, because I think, as we've noticed, something always happens in the supply chain that leads to a disruption. Again, nobody thought that a vessel would get stuck in the Suez Canal, a couple of years ago. And oh, by the way, we got one stuck on Baltimore right after that.
Glad you picked up on my big ships and non-traditional shipping ways comment right there.
But there's always something that happens, whether it's a man-made issue or natural disaster. I mean, we've got the hurricanes now hitting in Florida, so there's always something happening in the supply chain that retailers and others are constantly planning for. So having that four corners approach and diversification and risk mitigation practices in place helps you to ensure that you don't get stuck if something does occur. When folks certainly have migrated to the East Coast, a lot of that was because of the uncertainty with regards to the labor negotiations, both in 14, 15, and the most recent ones that we saw over the past couple of years. And hopefully we'll have an announcement soon on ratification of the RW contract. And nobody's waiting with bated breath. We've gotten through a couple of other key labor negotiations on rail and truck. So now we're just waiting on this one to be fully ratified. But that diversification is critical. And I think, as retailers are looking at getting more visibility into the supply chain, they're trying to make sure that they have product closer and closer to the consumer. So they're looking to see where are the consumers. A lot of them are now, on kind of the East Coast, and that's where they're setting up a lot of their supply chains and distribution centers to make sure they're able to meet those customers. And we talk about e-commerce and kind of that same day, next day, make sure they can utilize that and get the product to the customer when they expect it. So there's really has been over the past couple of years a reevaluation of what the retail supply chain looks like and how do they get better visibility and ensure that they have better access to the consumer at the end of the day.
Yeah, it seems all the cool kids are moving to Austin and Nashville these days. They get the California hipness without the California taxes, I guess, is the way that most people are looking at it. But you touched upon.
Yeah, but I would say to that point, though, the business environment is a huge issue as well. I mean, you mentioned California and some of the regulatory issues that we're facing, whether it's on the ports or elsewhere. I mean, look, we're all in favor of supporting environmental requirements and making sure we do it in the right way. But, as you guys know, the electric trucks, where's the power going to come from? Where are the trucks going to come from? What does the grid look like? Other efforts to limit the number of containers coming through the terminals, was it SCQAMD and their latest proposal? There was a letter sent last week that NRF signed signed by over 100 different groups talking about the negative impact that would have. And that would certainly cause folks to look elsewhere than LA and Long Beach to bring their cargo.
Yeah, zero emissions truck mandates. For the listeners that don't know, starting January 1 of next year, any new truck that you want to enter the port with has to be zero emissions. Same with rail rams or what they're calling high priority fleets. Now that's to say, for instance, we have carriers in our portfolio who have trucks that are new. They'll be able to use those for many years to come, a minimum of 13 years. But nonetheless, you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. How do you address capacity fluctuation in the market? We've got the South Coast Air Quality Management District putting facility caps. And in fact, the most draconian I've seen is they've literally said they put a cargo volume cap on the ports if that's what it takes to lower air emissions as it relates to goods movement. These are the types of things that you're talking about, John, that nobody can really predict because the infrastructure is not there, the science and technology is not ready for prime time, and those are just a couple of the issues scratching the surface. But I want to transition from environmental policy. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and one of the issues you mentioned at the top of the broadcast was labor. I mean, what's going to be the impact of the independent driver? AB5. What impact is that going to have on the workforce? And one, you're not going to have trucks because they can't meet the environmental mandate. You're not going to have drivers because they're not independent owner operators. So, I mean, that's going to have a huge hit on the supply chain.
We've done this far too often, John, because I was literally about to say, let's transition from environmental policy to labor policy, but you beat me to it. I actually wanted to talk on a positive note, though, so I'm glad you got that in with the regulation. But the first half of this year, and even going into last year, the back half of last year, your industry has dealt with maybe the most uncertainty from a supplier perspective when it comes to labor contracts. This has been a very tumultuous year with many labor unions having their first opportunity to get a bite at the COVID apple, and especially in our industry where they were frontline essential workers. Many of them who have put the labor issues behind them, that's been a big part of it, is getting that bite of the apple. But you're talking about something unprecedented. You're talking about the railroads. You're talking about the largest seaports in the nation with the U.S. West Coast. and you're talking about some of the largest truckers with the bankruptcy of Yellow, one of the major LTL carriers, due to their issues with their labor union. And then obviously, luckily, it went a different direction. But UPS, the largest parcel deliverer for many of your members to people's homes, and that's more and more important with the direct-to-consumer e-commerce model. Literally every leg of the supply chain, your members were waiting, holding their breath, hoping that strikes didn't happen. Luckily, we've gotten past all of them, and the yellow pieces are being picked back up by other motor carriers in the supply chain network. But talk a little bit about, that's good news going into the back half of the year. Talk a little bit about what that looked like the first half, and then we'll talk about what we can expect the rest of the year and maybe into next year.
Yeah, I mean, look, it was certainly a challenge as folks are trying to figure out what to do and how do you mitigate against the potential for disruption, whether it was, the potential for a rail strike, shutting down the entire rail system, UPS going down. I mean, it was all up to the last minute. And, there's only so much mitigation you can do against that because of capacity issues. Folks that were moving to the East Coast, there was only so much that they could do there in preparation if there were slowdowns, shutdowns. I mean, we saw disruptions happening at the West Coast off and on throughout the negotiations, which is typical. We see that every few years. But retailers and I think other industries as well try to mitigate against that and plan appropriately. That's why even before the contract negotiations started, many of my members are already making contingency plans and making that shift because as we've talked about previously, when the contract expired, we had called for the parties to extend the contract just because of the concern of any kind of disruption. Without a contract, there's nothing in place that would get them, either party, back to work if there were disruptions. So, retailers are constantly looking at their mitigation plans and trying to plan appropriately. With the threat against, UPS, a lot of folks shifted to FedEx, to USPS, and to other carriers as well. I think Cargomatic, yeah. I mean, look, there other folks were promoting their stability and trying to get customers away from UPS, and then do the customers go back? That's always a challenge. I know that's a challenge the West Coast is dealing with right now. Is the cargo returning from that cargo that left during the negotiations? And it's curious whether or not that's going to happen. I mean, some of that discretionary cargo might come back, but for a lot of folks that have found stability on the East Coast and better operations happening there, they're going to keep that cargo there. But we're getting through this year, and then we've got the East Coast labor contract that's up next September. The parties have started having negotiations. They've cooled off, but hopefully they'll get back to the table. But again, I think from the perspective of my members, they're looking for certainty and stability, and having those contracts done before they expire provides that opportunity for stability.
And we've seen some firsts, right? The Canadian ILW going on strike. That's never happened before. And then you brought up the ILA. They typically get ahead of this. They extend contracts. They lock up the deal before there's any jeopardy of a work stoppage. But it seems a little bit more in jeopardy of having a smooth negotiation this time around than in the past, because of some of the same hot button issues we saw on the West Coast. Just quickly talk about that, because we will transition now into what we're going to see, and I think that's probably one of the big. What are the big issues your members are looking at? That's got to be one of them.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, look, from my members' perspective, they want stability and certainty in the supply chain. That's throughout, from end to end. So again, trying to get better visibility into what's happening, ensuring that they are in line with what the customer is expecting. I mean, look, we all know forecasting has been difficult even in good years, and was totally thrown off through the pandemic of what was happening in forecasting. But again, trying to get that better visibility to get better control over inventory is where a lot of retailers have been focusing their time and effort. And I think they've done a good job at that, as you're seeing the inventory levels come back in line with kind of where we were pre-pandemic. And that's obviously had an impact on the ordering and kind of the downturn we've seen in the trade as well. But, I think right now it's trying to get post-pandemic, kind of where do we go? How do we keep the industry moving forwards? There's been a lot of innovation over the past couple of years within the retail industry, looking at things like, buy online, pick up in store, which hadn't been thought of pre-pandemic. to a high degree. But that's has picked up a lot of steam, and a lot of consumers enjoy that. Utilizing the store as the fulfillment center as well, again, to get closer to the customer. So folks are really putting a lot of time and effort into their supply chains to understand how to get to the consumer when they need to be there, which is really, really important for industry. I mean, there are a lot of other challenges that retailers continue to face, whether it's on the labor side. You're seeing stories every day now on the issue of retail crime, organized retail crime, which is another key priority for NRF. And that's not just the smash and grabs you're seeing on the nightly news, but that includes things like cargo theft and port piracy and everything else. So, there are a lot of other issues that we're working on.
You go near a railroad track, you're going to see stuff strewn about, even at terminals
Yeah.
sometimes. And these are some of the most secure facilities. You'll find holes cut in fence or trains showing up with the doors wide open on the intermodal containers. It's a real issue, John. And I can tell you, boots on the ground, we see it doing terminal tours or just in our daily course of business, watching freight trains.
I mean, look, we talked about this post 9/11, that cargo at rest is cargo at risk. So all the congestion issues that we faced throughout the pandemic, I mean, you had opportunity there for thieves to go and get into these containers, whether we're sitting on the rail yards or in the terminals. So that's why we got to keep these supply chains moving as quickly as possible and eliminate the opportunity for theft within the supply chain.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about inventory levels. Where are we today vis-a-vis inventory levels? Obviously, that's been one of the biggest roadblocks from a sense of seeing volume come back. Obviously, if you look at 2019, which is the last really comparable year, we're trending pretty similarly to 2019, and that was also the last year where we came off of some crazy event. It happened to be the tariffs at the end of kicking in at the beginning of 2019 that created huge freight years in 17 and 18, but this is an inventory driven one. And with consumer spending still super high and really the economy, there's some pockets that have felt recession-like, impacts, but by and large, the economy is doing really well, but the freight economy is still depressed. And while some companies like ourselves have figured out how to do it, and a lot of it's because we're everywhere and we're able to support our folks that are transitioning maybe from a West Coast to an East Coast. And I'm happy to be at a company that is in a good position. But whenever we see these freight recessions, there's a lot of truckers that don't make it. They go out of business. They take capacity out of the network. There's concerns in places like California. If they're locked out, if they're not active in the port, then you lose that capacity for the next uptick. Where are the inventory levels? And then more importantly, when's the freight coming back? When do we see those volumes pick back up?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, the inventory is back in line with kind of where we were pre-pandemic, as you noted. Obviously, I mean, look, the past couple of years were so challenging for everybody and were so unique, and folks didn't know how to address it. And obviously, early on in the pandemic, when you had consumers who were stuck at home, were being paid to stay home, basically, were spending because they weren't out doing anything else. Those spending patterns shifted because you don't need to get a new TV or new couch every year. So consumers changed how they were spending. So for a lot of retailers that over ordered, again, not knowing how the pandemic was going to go and how the consumer was going to continue to spend, some people got stuck with certain inventories. But I think they've been able to draw down on that through a variety of different avenues. So you're seeing those inventory levels back to kind of where they were pre-pandemic. But as you noted, the consumer spending very differently now than they were, over the past couple of years. Again, focusing in on kind of the essentials and on family. So you're going to continue to see that.
The shift from goods to services, pre-COVID, we were really a 70% services economy. During COVID, I joke we were like a 99% goods economy, other than the services that were allowed to stay open because they were essential. But we've shifted back, and in some cases, maybe a little bit more services because people hadn't taken vacations in many years or hadn't eaten out at restaurants, couldn't go to ball games. So in some instances, services are getting more attention than they did pre-pandemic, and I'm sure that'll come back in line. But that's the other big factor. People stopped buying stuff. They still were buying, just not stuff.
Yeah, I mean, but even with the focus back on services, consumers are still buying goods.
Hmm.
You know, for those that haven't taken a vacation and now taking vacations, they're going out buying a new outfit for vacation. You know, we just went to the beach, and I know I went and bought a bunch of stuff that we would need to take to the beach for the first time. So, you're still seeing those kinds of buying patterns. The import volumes are down, and that's not surprising because we had, record import volumes, during the pandemic that nobody had planned for. I mean, folks weren't looking at those volumes hitting until what, 24, 25 at the earliest. So we're back in line kind of where we were in kind of the 2019. We're low, low single digit, but growth continues. It's just not at the pace that we had seen over the past couple of years, which I think is expected. The ongoing, headwinds from inflation continue to put uncertainty out there, um, and impact the consumer. But as you know, is the economy continues to stay strong, the job market continues to stay strong. I mean, we're record lows on unemployment, so that all has an impact on the consumer and what their buying habits are. We'll have our holiday sales forecast coming out, I think, in either late October, early November. So we'll know more then, kind of how the consumer feels. But sales continue to grow month on month. So it's interesting to watch how this consumer is responding to the current economic environment.
Yeah, and you mentioned your consumer spending reports, and you guys do a great job with data. What's your gut telling you? What is your membership telling you? What is your data telling you vis-a-vis volumes for the rest of this year, and then really going into next year? Because there was a survey at the beginning of the year. I believe it was a CNBC poll that Lorianne LaRocco had commissioned, and it was very clear that the majority of folks either felt like they wouldn't see a return to their normal, whatever that was, until sometime in 2024. But almost, I think, a third of the folks didn't have any idea. They really were playing the long game of wait and see and pivot as needed. I feel like we're getting a little bit more clarity, although my crystal ball hasn't worked since 2022 the way that it historically did. But what is the Jon Gold crystal ball saying? And we won't hold you to it, understanding that there's a lot of factors at play.
My crystal ball remains foggy at this point in time. But I think it really depends. It depends on the retailer. I mean, look, you're seeing winners and losers throughout the retail economy, both small, medium, and large businesses. It really depends on kind of the sector you're in, and whether or not that's where consumers are spending their focus on those key essentials. Obviously, holidays are a little bit different, as you're looking to maybe splurge a little more than you would have on family and friends. But I think we're going to remain, at least on the import volumes, low single digits through the remainder of the year. And when we see that kick back up, it's so tough to tell right now. I think the hope is that we'll see that kick back up in 2024. But there's so much uncertainty in what happens in this economy. I mean, look, we've got a major event coming up in 2024 with the presidential election. And what kind of impact is that going to have on the economy going forwards as well? We've seen already, former President Trump talking about, a 10% tariff on everybody. He calls it ring around the country, more like ring around the collar. That's going to, increase prices on everybody, going to have a negative effect. So, there's a lot there that we continue to look at. But again, we continue to go back to the consumers are still spending, and they're just changing what they're spending on.
Yeah, and you talked about reports coming out later this year, October, November, and I'm really excited to see where that data lands. I'm sure we'll have you back on to, even if it's just a shorter version, to deep dive into those numbers a little bit. But you also have the big show, your Hallmark event coming up in January, and there's always a great event. You have so many things that retailers can look at, whether it's security, cybersecurity, economic outlook, supply chain. So highly encourage folks to attend the big show, because that's where you're really going to get the numbers all crunched as to what 2024 will look like. But sitting here today, last question I have for you is, what is the one or two things that you're really looking at as you're looking at navigating things? What should our listeners be paying attention to as it relates to the impacts on the retail industry, and or what the retail industry is experiencing, and how that's really an indicator for the economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, the issues I'm continuing to focus on right now are the ongoing trade issues and the relationship with China and what happens there. Obviously, that's going to have an impact on where retailers are sourcing and where they're shifting their sourcing to and from. We're glad to see that Secretary Raimondo was in China this week and hopefully have some good positive dialogues and we get back on a more stable timetable and discussion with China. They certainly continue to be a major partner while also a competitor. We've got to recognize that. So that certainly is something that we need to continue to pay attention to, and that's critically important for the West Coast ports because the majority of that cargo is coming from China. So that's really important. And then just other issues we're looking at. I mentioned the retail theft issue that continues to be a high priority for us, and trying to work with Congress and state and locals on trying to address those issues and bring more resources to that issue because that's an inventory issue as well. When the customer goes into a store and they see an empty shelf because a crew had just come in and wiped you out, 5 minutes earlier, that's a huge challenge. And also that for consumers is a concern to go shopping, which is something we're facing right now as consumers become a little scared to go shopping and employees are scared to work in stores when they see the violence rising tied to retail crime. It's a challenge. So those are some key issues that we're trying to address, as well as a host of others that are impacting the retail industry. Things like AI. What does that mean for the supply chain of retail and everything else? So always something going on in retail, and we try to stay on top of it and make sure we're working with our partners like Cargomatic. Make sure you guys are aware and you guys can help address any of those issues for our members.
Yeah, well, we appreciate your members, the opportunity to work with them. We're here to help them solve any problems that we can think about. So we'll continue to do our part and hopefully help them continue to look at importing record volumes and allowing just the pie to get bigger. I share a lot of the same concerns you have vis-a-vis some of the man-made issues that we're creating through public policy and what that does, both from a worker perspective and an inflation perspective. But, hopefully the story down the road, not too far, isn't that the looters have over inventory because they've gotten so good at these, what do they call it? They're not flash mobs, the smash mobs. There we go. Smash and grab mobs. But anyway, Jon, it's always good to have you on, and look forward to having you on again when the data starts coming in and we can address it. We like to stay up to speed, both from our customers as well as our partner carriers and all of our industry partners as to what's going on and what to be prepared for. And as you and I know, that's really what we're all trying to accomplish is a predictive supply chain that we can really set our compass to and try to navigate. That's why we're such a big proponent of data and visibility, because that's going to be the next big thing. And I firmly believe that what we're doing today is setting the standard for what you guys and your members are asking for the industry to look like moving forward. So it's always good to have you on. Any final words for the listeners and watchers?
No, I was just saying, I mean, look, you brought up a good point there about the need for data and visibility. And if we go back to kind of, where you and I started over a decade ago, a lot of those issues still exist on the congestion issues and challenges we see at the ports. So, as we look to whatever that next event is coming down the pike, because we know something's coming, we've got to figure out a better path forward on addressing these supply chain issues, because we can't get stuck like we did, throughout the pandemic. So working on data and visibility and operational issues is critical. We've got to figure that out before the next thing hits.
Well, Jon, thanks for joining us. Really, when we talk about people on the move, Jon, recognized, congratulations, as one of the most influential people on Capitol Hill this past year, and in no small part due to all the great work that you do for America's retailers, the folks that providing us with all the daily essentials, and then in some cases the non-daily essentials, but the things we like to have, like our big screen TVs and couches, just not maybe every year, as you just said. But Jon, keep up the good work. We really appreciate the partnership with the National Retail Federation here at Cargomatic. And thanks for joining us. And to our listeners, that's another episode of People on the Move with Jon Gold of the National Retail Federation. I'm Weston LaBar for Cargomatic, and we'll see you next time.